I remember when my wife and I first came back to Australia from Colombia. We had been living in Colombia for some time, and we decided for various reasons about getting to know my family and seeing where I had grown up that in about 2011 it was time for us to go back and get to know a bit about my past and my background. And one of the first places we took Cami to, Cami's my wife, one of the first places we took her to was a place called Bells Beach, which is a beautiful beach down in Torquay in Victoria, which is my hometown where I grew up in. And it's a beach which is renowned for not only its beauty, but also its perfect and its very powerful waves. And it was actually on the second day, which me and Cami got back to Torquay, where my family and we decided we're going to take Cami down to Bells Beach. And it was really good timing as the waves on this particular day were absolutely massive. They were huge. A big storm had come across precisely on the day that we were there. And I remember as all of us were making our way, we got to the car park, and as we started to make our way down the steps towards the beach, we could hear the waves. They were that big. They were huge and they were powerful and they were roaring. We could hear them as we were coming down. And it was a sight that would have been impressive for anyone to come upon. But I remember as we got down onto the sand to the beach, and I actually looked over at Cami just to see how she was reacting to it. And I noticed that she was crying. She just had tears coming down her face. You see, Cami had she grew up in Colombia. She grew up in a place called Bogota, and she'd only been to the beach and seen the beach, a handful of times. And as she got down there, and as she saw these waves, the sight of these huge waves in this beautiful beach, and the roaring and the crashing of the waves, it was absolutely overwhelming for her. And I remember as I looked over towards her and I said, man, this is really affecting her. And I went and asked her, I said, hey, you okay? And I'll never forget what she said. She says, I've never felt the presence of God so powerfully in nature in my life. It was a really powerful and emotional reaction from Cami. But for me and my family, who were just really accustomed to the beach, we had grown up there and we'd basically seen the beach every day of our lives. For us, this scene at Bells Beach that day, it was still really nice. It was still really beautiful. It was still really powerful. But at that time, at that time in our lives, it had ceased to bring us to tears. It had ceased to bring us to our knees, in a sense, in awe and wonder. But it hadn't for Cami. And I think that same thing could actually be said about Easter. And what do I mean by that? I think that our modern, our Western eyes have gazed on this wonderful story and heard this wonderful story of Jesus for so long that we've actually lost our appreciation for the richness of this time and this story. And I think a way for us to actually recapture the beauty of this story is not to only go back to the cross of Christ and when he died there, is not only go back there, but I think for us to actually recapture the beauty of this story, we could even go back to the cross and further. And when I say go further back, I want us to go this morning 1,000 years, more or less, 1,000 years back before the life of Jesus. And if we do that, if we go back 1,000 years before the life of Jesus, we come across a man by the name of Samuel. Now, if you haven't heard of Samuel before, Samuel was a prophet, and he was pretty much the first of many a prophet who actually came and gave a very similar message. These prophets, starting with Samuel, brought this message that there was going to be a time where God would actually rule from Israel, and he would from Israel he would rule all over the world. And the message was more than this. It was not only that God would rule, but he was also going to rescue the nation of Israel from its enemies and from its oppressors. And also that this God would be a king, and that this rule would come through a righteous king, a good king, and a worthy king. So you can imagine what started to happen, right? When Samuel came with these words and started to speak these words amongst the nation of Israel. All of a sudden, the Israelites would have been saying to each other, okay, this sounds good, so where is this king? We've got to go and find ourselves this king, right? And so the search began, right? The search began for this good king who was going to come and who was going to rescue Israel and destroy all of her enemies. And so with this promise of a king, as I said, began the search of a king. The Israelites started to search for this king, and they found one, and they chose him to lead them. And the first king they chose to lead them was a man by the name of Saul. Now, when you look at selection criteria, it wasn't a really thorough criteria that the Israelites went through to actually choose Saul to be their king. Because they basically chose him because he was handsome, he was tall, and he was powerful looking, pretty much. And I said straight off the bat, that is not good selection criteria when you're choosing your potential leader, or especially your king. And this was quickly proven to be true, that it was a flawed way to choose someone, because Saul was actually a disaster of a king. For many reasons, but some of the obvious ones were he was an extremely jealous individual. He also didn't trust God. This was a nation who were followers of God, of Yahweh, and he didn't trust God. He didn't trust God at all, and he showed this many, many times. But the sort of the nail in the coffin was when Saul actually was actually rejected by God because of his intrusion into a sacred space which was put aside for priests. And he went in and started to try to perform this priestly function. Saul sort of pushed himself, and he could do this only when he, by abusing his power as king, he pushed himself into this priestly role. And he was therefore rejected by God, and that was it. That was the end of Saul. So after this happened, the nation of Israel, their hope isn't gone. They still want to find this king. So their hope now shifts elsewhere from Saul for the search of this righteous and good king. And it actually shifts over to a young man. And this young man is named David. This young man was called David. Now, you might have heard of King David before. And if you have heard of him, you might have heard some really good things about him. And King David, he did indeed have some good moments throughout his reign as king. He really did. Like, he loved God. He loved God, and there were so many times throughout the story of David where you hear about his mercy, which is a reflection of God. But when you sit back and look at his whole reign as king, it was a bit of a disaster as well. And David, firstly, he took another man's wife. He actually took this, because he was king, he can do what he wanted. He took this woman away from her man, and he actually sent that man into the front line of a battle. And he knew that anyone in the front line of this battle was definitely going to be killed. And David sent him there knowing that so he could have this woman for himself. David was also described by God himself as a man with bloody hands. David was a person who was actually responsible for much bloodshed in his lifetime. And along with this, and along with the immoral decisions that he made in his life, his reign as king was also not a successful one. It was not the king they were waiting for. But their hope, they still didn't lose hope. There was still hope on the horizon. And that actually came with the arrival of King David's son. And his son's name was Solomon. Now, Solomon was a man who was blessed. He was blessed with, it tells us, immeasurable wisdom. He was extremely wealthy. And with those two things, of course, comes power, right? So he was a blessed individual. In his reign as king, he also expanded the kingdom greatly during his reign. But it all starts off really good, but as time goes on, and as he gets closer to the end of his reign as king, Solomon's story also ends tragically. And why do I say this? Because Solomon, first of all, he had his heart turned away from God quite early on, but it actually started to show as his life got on. And this happened because, without exaggerating, Solomon actually had his heart turned from God because of the hundreds of wives and concubines he took for himself. He was literally in sexual relationships with hundreds, maybe even thousands of different women. So his heart was not for God. It was not dedicated to God. His heart wasn't even for his own people. And we see in the life of Solomon that his heart was primarily, first and foremost, for his own pleasures, his own desires, his search for his own satisfaction. So again, this was not going to be the long-awaited righteous king who the nation of Israel, the people of Israel, had been waiting and longing for so long. Things actually got so bad under Solomon's rule that the kingdom, actually the kingdom which he was the king over, it actually split in two, went to the northern kingdom of Israel and the southern kingdom of Judah. So by the time Solomon dies, the kingdom is split in two. Things are not going well at all. And if you're looking for hope after Solomon, just don't look for it, because things just keep getting worse. All the kings, remember we have two kingdoms now, all the kings we read about that follow Solomon, that are kings of the northern part, the northern part of the kingdom, they are all bad when you read about them. You don't actually read of one good one throughout the whole history. They are all corrupt and they are all woeful. And when you talk about the southern kingdom, it's not much better. There is a sprinkling of a couple of good ones here and there, but in general, the outlook for this righteous king, this promised king that is going to come, is not looking promising. That light that sort of appeared when Samuel came and started to talk about these things with the nation of Israel, that light was growing dimmer and dimmer and dimmer. As each day, as each year, as each generation passed, it looked like this light was going to go out. And just to show how bad it really did get, there was one king, well, there's many, but there was one king, it was the 14th king of the kingdom of Judah, and his name was Manasseh. Now, Manasseh turned up, and he arrived some 300 years after the prophet Samuel had actually begun to proclaim about this righteous king. So Manasseh turns up, and if you want to know anything about Manasseh, there's probably one place you can go to find out all you really need to know about Manasseh, and that's in one of the Old Testament books, which is 2 Chronicles. And if you go to 2 Chronicles, chapter 33, verse 9, this is what you'll read about Manasseh. It says, "But Manasseh led Judah and the people of Jerusalem astray, so that they did," get this, "more evil than the nations the Lord had destroyed before the Israelites." So this Manasseh, a king of Israel, had actually led his people down a path that was even more evil than the child sacrificing Canaanites who God had gotten rid of before the Israelites came to this land. Things had gotten bad, really, really bad. And you could imagine the feeling amongst the Israelites now. They would have been absolutely desperate. With Manasseh as king, with the northern kingdom now in captivity, and the southern kingdom being taken over at that present time, this was a dark, dark time for Israel. And we talk about that light going out before. It seemed like it was just about to be put out for good. But around this time, another individual turns up, and he starts to speak to the nation of Israel. And we see his words written today. And we'll get there in a minute, but this individual who started to speak to the nation of Israel, I believe the words that he would have said to them, they would have given the nation of Israel two things. They would have got two things from what he was saying. And I think the first thing they would have been a sense of hope. This individual and what he was saying would have given the nation of Israel a sense of hope. And this might seem contradictory, but the second thing that the nation of Israel would have received from this man's words would have also been deep confusion. So, a sense of hope and deep confusion. Now, what do I mean by that? Well, let me tell you about this individual. This individual's name was Isaiah. Now, Isaiah was one of the Old Testament prophets. And to read about him, you go to the book of Isaiah, which is quite a large book. It has 66 different chapters. But there is one chapter in particular that I would like to share with you and talk about right now. And that is chapter 53. Now, this chapter 53 speaks to the reader about the very core of Jewish and Christian faith. One theologian actually wrote this about chapter 53 of Isaiah. He wrote, "Although Isaiah 53 was written some 700 years before Christ's death, it looks as if it had been written beneath the cross upon Golgotha." In chapter 53, the person of Jesus Christ, who is the long-awaited King, absolutely explodes off the pages. I want to read it to you now. And remember, when we read this, as you listen to these words, remember as we go through it that these words were written some 700 years before Jesus Christ graced the earth. Let's read it together. Isaiah 53. He had no beauty or majesty to attract us to him, nothing in his appearance that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by mankind, a man of suffering and familiar with pain. Like one from whom people hid their faces, he was despised, and we held him in low esteem. Surely he took up our pain and bore our suffering. Yet we considered him punished by God, stricken by him and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions. He was crushed for our iniquities. The punishment that brought us peace was on him, and by his wounds we are healed. We all, like sheep, have gone astray. Each of us have turned to our own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all. He was oppressed and afflicted, yet he did not open his mouth. He was led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before its shearers is silent, so he did not open his mouth. By oppression and judgment he was taken away. Yet who of his generation protested? For he was cut off from the land of the living. For the transgression of my people he was punished. He was assigned a grave with the wicked and with the rich in his death, though he had done no violence, nor was any deceit in his mouth. Yet it was the Lord's will to crush him and cause him to suffer. And though the Lord makes his life an offering for sin, he will see his offspring and prolong his days, and the will of the Lord will prosper in his hand. After he has suffered, he will see the light of life and be satisfied. By his knowledge, my righteous servant will justify many, and he will bear their iniquities. Therefore, I will give him a portion among the great, and he will divide the spoils with the strong, because he poured out his life unto death and was numbered with the transgressors. For he bore the sin of many and made intercession for the transgressors. So tell me, did you see Christ there? Did you hear Jesus as we read that? He is absolutely everywhere. He was despised and rejected, it tells us. He took up our pain and he bore our suffering. He was pierced for our transgressions and he was crushed for our iniquities. And the punishment that brought us peace was on him. And by his wounds we are healed. You could keep going and picking parts of that because it is everywhere. The death, the crucifixion of Jesus Christ is so blatantly in those words which we just read. It should actually grip you to the core. And then there's that last line. It says, for he bore the sins of many and made intercession for the transgressors. You know, there is no Old Testament scripture that so often and so convincingly is applied to Jesus Christ by the New Testament than this one. And it is in this prophecy from Isaiah that is where we're actually shown, and we are still shown today so clearly, what this righteous king that Samuel and all the other prophets were talking about, what this king that the Israelites and who the Israelites had been waiting for was actually really going to look like. Their image of the king, and then Isaiah gives us the image of the true king. He says, this is what your king is going to look like. Where Israel were waiting for a king who was tall, strong, and physically impressive, Isaiah promised them a king who would have no beauty or attractiveness to him. Where Israel were waiting for a king who would be loved and who would be honored and who would be praised by all the nations, Isaiah promised them a king who would be despised and who would be rejected by humanity. Where Israel were waiting for a king who would cry out woes and cry out judgment on all the oppressive nations and evil nations around them, Israel promised them a king who, like a lamb led to the slaughter, would go there in silence and wouldn't even open his mouth. And where Israel were waiting for a king who would come and who would punish and who would crush and who would destroy their enemies, Isaiah promised them a king who would suffer and die for their enemies. This is a moving image of what the promised king, not what he was going to be like, but what he is really like. There is a great line, or probably a great scene during a movie, and this movie is called 300. And the scene has these two kings from opposing nations, and they're in the middle of this conversation, and they're trying to negotiate this deal instead of going to battle. And one king, who has a far larger and a far more powerful army behind him, he's a little bit cocky, and he starts to almost laugh at the other king, and starts to sort of mock him, and he speaks to him in his overconfident voice, and he says to the lesser king, he says, "It isn't wise for you to stand against me." He says, "Imagine what horrible fate awaits my enemies when I would gladly kill any of my men, my own men, for victory." And then the other king, he looks at him, and straight away, undeterred by this threat, he quickly responds back to him, "And I would gladly die for any one of my men." And this is exactly what our King did. Jesus died for each and every one of us. And it is through that death, through the death of Jesus, that we are offered life. And we are offered life with him, with God. And today, I just want to urge each and every one of us to not just hear those words, but to embrace them. To actually hear them as if it was the first time you have ever heard them before. And actually let them become a part of your very soul. And I just hope and pray that this story and this person of Christ the King, can be the light and hope in your life during these difficult and dark times that we are all in. Amen.